It is the middle of the 1400s, and two painters are at work in the chapel of a hospital in Florence. One is Andrea, a jealous and spiteful Florentine. The other, a fun-loving Venetian import named Domenico. Domenico is greatly celebrated by the people of Florence. He is caressed and honored for his talents, including by the local women, whose appreciation he enthusiastically reciprocates. What makes his work so astonishing is his new technology. He is one of the few people in all of Italy who knows how to use oil paints. Andrea is jealous both of Domenico's talents and of the acclaim that this foreigner has received in Florence. So he decides to do something about it. His plan involves a disguise, a dark night, a deserted street corner, and a hammer with which he knocks Domenico over the head and kills him. Hello and welcome. I'm Ross King. This is Renaissance Discoveries, and the story that I just told you is a Florentine urban legend from the 14 and 1500s. And like many urban legends, it's not true. The art historian Giorgio Vasari is often blamed for starting this myth, but the story was actually told at least as early as about 1520, when young Giorgio was still in short pants. The two artists supposedly involved in this murderous intrigue were Andrea del Castagno and Domenico Veneziano. We know it can't be true because Andrea died in 1457, a good 4 years before his supposed victim. But it's a compelling tale, and not just because it's about jealousy and murder, but also because it involves this new technology, oil paint. Oil-based paint did indeed in the 1400s grant almost miraculous powers and tremendous fame to those who could find out and then master the secrets of its application. The rise of oil painting in the 1400s marks a huge breakthrough in Western art. It gave artists a much greater ability to portray color and light convincingly, to texture their surfaces, and to add exquisite and incredibly lifelike details. Like linear perspective, invented around the same time, and see my video on that, it cast over artists a spell that would last for centuries, a spell that would see painters striving ever harder to imitate reality. So what was the secret of oil paint? How did its use come about? As always in these videos, we're going to plunge into history and also look at a few myths to come up with some answers. Oil paint is simply ground up pigments mixed with some kind of oil, such as that made from linseeds or poppy seeds or walnuts, maybe with a plant resin added. All pigments need some kind of liquid to bind them together. Painters traditionally mix their pigments with two different media. First of all, water, so basically watercolor painting, which was used in frescoes with the watercolors applied to the wet plaster. The second was egg, that is for egg tempera, a technique that goes back to ancient Egypt. Artists for the most part used the yolk of the egg to bind their pigments, which means a lot of egg white omelets probably got eaten in painters' studios to use up the leftovers. Many beautiful and famous works have been done in tempera paint. Just think of all the wonderful medieval altarpieces. But tempera had certain limitations. The paint couldn't be added very thickly. It needed to be applied thinly in short, regular strokes. It also dried quickly, so the colors couldn't be blended together on the surface of the painting. You couldn't paint wet on wet or manipulate colors together. So you were fairly limited in terms of what we might call the expressive or painterly aspects and effects. As Giorgio Vasari wrote in the 1560s, by the 1400s, artists felt that a certain softness and freshness was missing from their paintings, and they therefore experimented, he claimed, with various other techniques, the most promising of which was mixing their pigments with oil. Now, one of the first things to note is that, contrary to what Vasari suggests, oil painting was not actually invented in the 1400s. Far from it. The ancient Romans had mixed oil as well as wax into their exterior paints, but it gradually came to be used for more artistic purposes. in the year 540 AD, a doctor in Mesopotamia, one Aetius, described how painters suspended their pigments in linseed and almond oil for painting and gilding. Recently, some ancient oil paintings have come to light in Afghanistan. The destruction by the Taliban of the Buddhas of Bamiyan in March 2001, horrible as that was, led to the discovery of an entrance to a network of some 50 caves where these murals were painted in the 600s AD. 12 of the caves have wall paintings, many showing the Buddha, in which the artists appear to have used oil as a binder for their pigments, probably walnut or poppy oil. Painters certainly used oil as a binder in the Middle Ages, especially north of the Alps. Someone named Theophilus Presbyter, a German, about whom nothing else is known, wrote a work in the middle of the 1100s in which he described how painters mixed their pigments with oils. But he noted that the process was excessively long and tedious because the oils dried so slowly. So the slow drying of oils is seen as a drawback at this point, whereas ultimately it would become one of its great benefits. So oil painting could be done by 1400. It's difficult to know how widespread the practice was by, say, the 1300s, because only 5% of all the works painted in the 14th century still survive. So we have a very limited sample. However, there are mentions of it in various documents, as when in 1356, the Duke of Normandy, the future King Charles the Wise, asks for his castle to be decorated with paintings done in fine colors in oil. Moving on to Italy, in about 1400, the Florentine painter Cennino Cennini wrote an instruction book for painters in which he describes how to paint in oils, which he says is much practiced by the Germans. He goes on to describe how to make oil paint by taking linseed oil, putting it in a copper bowl in the hot weather, and leaving it out in the sun until half of it evaporates. The artist then grinds his pigment with the resulting oil. In Florence, he writes, "I have found the finest and best that there can be." Proof that around 1400, artists in Florence were using oil paint. So oil painting was certainly practiced in, at the very least, a limited way during the Middle Ages. However, even if it was used, the technique and execution were far from perfect and the potential not fully appreciated or exploited. And the tempera tradition, in any case, was well entrenched. The times were obviously not yet right for oil paint, in Italy at least. We don't know of any great masterpiece of oil painting from the 1300s or before, or for that matter, of any work of real significance from those times done in oil. Around the turn of the 1400s, the time that Cennini was writing his book, the man who was probably the most sought after painter in Italy, Lorenzo Monaco, was producing gigantic altarpieces that were entirely in egg tempera. Even if Lorenzo could paint in oils, and he probably knew how to, he chose tempera with these undeniably spectacular results. Here we see his wonderful Coronation of the Virgin, now in the Uffizi. It was originally done for a monastery in the heart of Florence. It's splendidly rich in color, not least in gold and lapis lazuli. Its decorative beauty and luminosity come from this liberal application of gold leaf. A little bit after Lorenzo, the most innovative painter in Florence in the 1420s, Masaccio, in his panel paintings, such as this one, worked in the traditional medium of tempera. The man who exploited the technique of painting in oils, who showed what could be done in the medium, came from the other side of the Alps, and that was the great Netherlandish painter Jan van Eyck, who was born about 1390 near Maastricht in present-day Belgium. Vasari claimed that Van Eyck invented oil painting. He claims that he delighted in alchemy and set to work sort of like a mad scientist, experimenting with various types of oils, finally coming up with a mixture of linseed and nut oil. No one today believes that Jan van Eyck invented oil painting. Scientific studies have shown that he used what's called heat-bodied linseed oil, that is, oil that was gently heated, perhaps left in a shallow dish in the sun, as Cennini, for example, had advised. So there was nothing new in his medium. However, Jan and his older brother Hubert were the first ones to make the most of its properties, to show its truly astounding capabilities when used by artists of their caliber who combined acute powers of observation with a profound grasp of how to work in this tricky medium. The issue with oil paint was not the actual ingredients so much as the technique of application. Previously, most painters had probably used oils as if they were painting in tempera with unimpressive results. The secret of Jan van Eyck, if we can call it that, was applying oil paint differently in a series of glazes. Mixing pigments in oils makes them translucent, which allowed Van Eyck to apply his colors in a succession of thin layers, sometimes as many as 5 or 6. He let each layer dry before adding the next glaze, and the results were glossy, glowing tones that built up a depth of field of remarkable color, as if he were superimposing one sheet of colored glass onto another. So artists had worked in oil before, but no one with such consummate mastery of the medium. The Ghent altarpiece by both Jan and Hubert, the latter of whom died soon after it was begun in 1426, is the world's first true masterpiece in oil paint. Almost 600 years later, we can't not be astounded by the dexterity with which the Van Eycks worked, how they depicted flesh, precious stones, and beautiful fabrics, all with such stunning precision. Jan van Eyck was an alchemist of sorts, conjuring all the beauty and splendor of the natural world out of his powdered pigments and drops of linseed oil. The Arnolfini Portrait is another virtuoso performance. Jan brilliantly exploited the properties of oil paint, the ability to create exquisite details, as well as to blend and smudge the pigments for great effect. In fact, he even used his fingers, since his fingerprints have been found beneath the dog, and he also blotted with his fingers at the green in the robe of Arnolfini's wife. Oil was that kind of tactile, painterly medium in which you could experiment while the work was on the easel still wet. The Van Eyck brothers therefore used the special properties of oil paint to build up an illusion of reality with an unequaled sophistication. They would have dazzled with egg tempera, but oil allowed them to take things to even greater heights. So to sum up, the real trick wasn't so much the actual recipe as it was how to handle this new medium on the palette and panel. By the 1440s, probably only a smallish group of painters in Flanders knew the techniques of painting with oil in successive glazes. Included among them, though, had been two other big guns in Flemish art, Rogier van der Weyden and Robert Campin. Trade and cultural links between Italy and Flanders, as well as Italian appreciation of artistic excellence, meant oil paint was bound to attract interest in Italy once its potential was seen. After all, it was in Italy that artists were experimenting with techniques of giving the viewer a kind of virtual reality, of enhancing the lifelike aspects of their paintings. In the first decades of the 15th century, artists in Florence had developed linear perspective as a way of bringing depth, the third dimension, into the space of the picture. And oil paint, which gives luminosity, volume, and the ability to add minute and accurate details, would be one more aspect of this campaign to make things real, so to speak. And so we would expect Italian artists and their patrons to sit up and take note of this remarkable new technical wizardry. Vasari claims oil painting took root in Italy thanks to a painter named Antonello da Messina, who came from Sicily, from Messina, an important seaport, in fact, the port at which the Black Death arrived in Europe in October 1347. Vasari writes that Antonello saw paintings by Van Eyck in Naples. He then goes on to say that these works had such an effect upon him that, laying aside all other matters, he set off for Flanders. And here, according to Vasari, he met the aged Van Eyck, who divulged the secret of oil paint to him. Well, the story of this meeting is almost certainly false, because Antonello was probably only 11 or 12 when Van Eyck died in 1441. However, there can be absolutely no doubt that Antonello saw and was deeply impressed by Flemish art, likely works including ones by Van Eyck that he saw in Naples, because King Alfonso of Naples, a great patron of the arts, owned works by both Van Eyck and van der Weyden. But it may well be the case that Antonello went to the Low Countries at some point, albeit after Van Eyck's death, and so it could have been there that he learned the special Netherlandish technique of painting with oil in a series of glazes. Again, though, we have to puncture a myth. Antonello was not the first Italian artist of the 1400s to work adeptly and successfully with oil paint in the Flemish style. The man with whom he appears to have trained in Naples, Niccolo Colantonio, was working in the medium by the 1440s, himself inspired by Flemish examples, including that of an artist working in Naples as a court painter, a man named Barthélemy van Eyck, supposedly a relative of Jan and Hubert. Colantonio even made copies of works by Van Eyck and van der Weyden, and he could have passed on his knowledge to Antonello. So the story is a bit more complicated, but it is true, at least, that the enthusiasm for painting in oils and the expertise to do so went from Flanders to Naples. And it's true that Antonello was one of the first confident and accomplished practitioners in Italy. And is he good or what? In this work, Christ at the Column, he makes his oil paints more fluid by mixing them with essential oils, a technique that had just begun to be used in Flanders. And so it does suggest that he was au fait with the latest techniques. But the key thing is what he does with the technique, because look at the detail he's able to give us, the teardrops, the drops of blood, fine details in the hair, the light in the irises of the eyes. This is a virtuoso performance, and this is what oil paint can do for you. Antonello enjoyed a great reputation, despite the fact that he spent basically his entire career not in Florence or Rome or in another great artistic center, but in Sicily. However, he did go to Venice in 1475, and here he apparently stunned the Venetians with his work. And maybe we can believe that story if indeed he took a work like this with him as a sample of what he could do. There's an urban legend that when Antonello was in Venice, the great Venetian painter Giovanni Bellini tricked him into exposing the secret of oil by disguising himself as a Venetian nobleman, turning up at his studio, asking for his portrait to be painted, and then watching carefully as Antonello went to work. That story can't be true because Bellini was working in oil paint before Antonello came to town. For example, in the Pizarro altarpiece begun in the 1470s. Bellini, though, would become one of the great practitioners, and Venice over the following century became one of the great centers of oil painting, thanks to artists such as Titian and Tintoretto, who explored the medium with tremendous ambition and skill. Now, technological change is not always as quick and absolute as we might expect it to be. Old habits die hard. In the second half of the 1400s, despite the arrival of oil paint, painters in Italy continued to work happily in egg tempera. The two technologies, oil and tempera, overlapped. Sometimes they even overlapped quite literally in the same painting, because a painter might do a work in tempera and then add a top layer of glazes in oil. There was also the medium, which was popular in Florence in the final decades of the 1400s, known as tempera grassa, fatty tempera. Pigments were suspended in a mixture of oil and egg yolk. This allowed artists to overcome some of the limitations of tempera, making it so they could blend their pigments more effectively by keeping them from drying so quickly on the panel. This particular mixture was used by artists such as Sandro Botticelli, Pietro Perugino, Michelangelo in the Doni Tondo, which he painted in the first decade of the 1500s. Tempera grassa was also used by Leonardo da Vinci in The Last Supper, which of course is not painted in fresco. Leonardo suspended his pigments in a combination of oil and egg yolk after much experimentation in which he tried to come up with a magical recipe for painting on a wall. At other times, a panel might be painted partly in oils and partly in tempera, making a kind of hybrid of the two techniques. This is Andrea del Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, now in the Uffizi. It was painted around 1475, around the time, that is, that Antonello was going to Venice to wow the Venetians. Verrocchio worked only in tempera, but Leonardo, for many years his apprentice and co-worker, touched up parts of it with oil paint. For example, the body of Christ, the landscape background, and the angel on the left, into whose blue robe he deliberately pressed a piece of cloth, leaving its imprint, a bold use of the properties of oil paint to convey a realistic appearance of fabric, something he could never have done with tempera. So Leonardo, as we might expect, was an enthusiastic convert. He was fascinated with this new technology that allowed him to experiment with, to think out loud, so to speak, on the surface of his painting. The Mona Lisa, for example, is an oil painting. The subtle changes in light and shade, the atmospheric effects, the veils of color, and intricate detail would simply not have been possible in egg tempera, or it could not have been carried out, at least, with such stupefying effects. A good example of an artist who experimented with all of the techniques is Leonardo's contemporary and friend, Sandro Botticelli. He did work in tempera, such as the famous Birth of Venus, which he painted in the mid-1480s. A few years afterwards, in the early 1490s, he worked in tempera grassa, as in his Coronation of the Virgin or the San Marco altarpiece, likewise in the Uffizi. And then a few years after that, around 1500, he painted his Mystic Nativity completely in oil paint. By this time, we've reached the 16th century, and it will be the century, like those that follow it, of oil paint, which would reign supreme on easels, on panels, and on canvases. It will become the choice of Titian, of Rembrandt, Caravaggio, Goya, Turner, the Impressionists, and the Post-Impressionists. Great fresco paintings will be done in the 16th and 17th centuries, but for the most part, being a painter would come to mean working in oil. Now, we've needed to correct or dispel a few myths regarding the so-called invention or discovery of oil painting, but the story of its impact on art can't be doubted. Like perspective, its adoption in the 1400s signaled a major change in European painting. It was a technology that gave painters a magical new power because it greatly enhanced their ability to represent the world in an astonishingly lifelike way, and also to give it an expressive twist to show their individuality and personality. And in giving them that power, it raised them to new and, in some cases, Olympian heights. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, please watch more, and please, if you want to know more about art in Italy in the 1400s and 1500s, please do you and me both the kindness of reading some of my books, waiting for you in your favorite bookshop. Thank you.